Section 1. The Garden Party, Hook. The garden party at Fernwood House was, by all accounts, the most splendid affair St. Mary Mead had seen in years. The sun shone benevolently through gaps in the billowing clouds, dappling the clipped lawns and the guests alike in golden patches of warmth. Children ran laughing among rose trellises and hedgerows, while a quartet of local musicians plucked away at cheerful tunes near the sundial. The smell of honeysuckle mingled with warm lemon drizzle cake and strawberry preserves, wafting over from the buffet table set under a striped canopy. Fernwood House itself stood at a slight elevation at the rear of the grounds, an imposing Georgian manor of honey-coloured stone, recently cleaned of the moss and creeping vines that had clung to it during its years of abandonment. The ivy had been trimmed back, the leaded windows polished, and the front steps scrubbed clean. Even the aged fountain in the centre of the circular drive had been coaxed into working again, and it burbled gently as if content to have witnesses to its resurrection. The villagers had gathered eagerly, curiosity drawing them like bees to clotted cream. This was the first open event at Fernwood since the mysterious death of its previous mistress, Miss Lavinia Templeton, a woman whose name still elicited murmurs and half-remembered tales of eccentric habits, suspicious bookkeeping, and, of course, that rumoured fortune hidden somewhere within the house. Her passing 10 years ago to the day had never sat comfortably with everyone in the village, though the doctor had declared it natural. Peaceful in her sleep, they'd said. But Lavinia had never been a peaceful woman. Miss Jane Marple, that genteel and deceptively unobtrusive fixture of St. Mary Mead, was seated beneath a flowering laburnum tree at the edge of the lawn, her eyes gently half-lidded, her fingers lightly brushing against the wool of her knitting. She was not knitting, however. She had paused mid-row, an uncharacteristic thing for her, and instead was watching. From her vantage point, she could see nearly the entire garden, the white tablecloths rippling in the breeze, the vicar in conversation with Mr. Merriweather, the banker, and the slow advance of the more gossipy women toward the punch bowl. She had already noted 3 refills from Mrs. Leslie Thatcher, and the subtle nods exchanged between 2 young ladies in lavender dresses when Giles Arbuthnot had emerged from the drawing-room. Mr. Arbuthnot, Fernwood's new master, was a man of perhaps 50, with a sun-tanned face, short-cropped dark hair greying at the temples, and the kind of posture that suggested either military service or lifelong self-control. He wore a crisp linen suit, impeccably white, with a thin navy tie that sat exactly centred at his collarbone. His polished shoes, she observed, shone with almost obsessive care. The way he walked, with measured, deliberate steps, spoke of a man accustomed to scrutiny. There was something in his eyes, though, that unsettled Miss Marple, a constant flicker of watchfulness like a cat waiting for something to dart from the hedge. "Well?" came a voice beside her, drawing her attention to Mrs. Dolly Bantry, who had just settled into the adjacent wicker chair with a sigh, fanning herself with her garden programme. "He's certainly not what I expected. Dashing, yes, but far too neat. I don't trust men who polish their shoes that thoroughly. It suggests vanity or guilt. Possibly both." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Or perhaps," she said, her voice mild as ever, "he simply takes pride in appearances. It's not an uncommon trait in men who've lived a long time away from England." Mrs. Bantry sniffed. "That's what Colonel Pembroke said. South Africa, apparently. Gold mines, if you believe Mrs. Ridgewell. Of course, she also believes cats can see ghosts. Many people do, in fact, murmured Miss Marple. Well, still, I can't help feeling it's rather convenient, him arriving on the 10th anniversary of Miss Templeton's death, and just in time to host a party for the entire village, stirring up the ghosts if you ask me. Ghosts, said Miss Marple, have a habit of remaining quiet until someone gives them a reason to speak. Their conversation was interrupted by the shrill peal of children's laughter near the apple orchard, followed by the sound of shattering crockery. A young maid ran off, flustered, to retrieve the pieces of a fallen teacup. Everything was unfolding, as it always did at such village gatherings. Familiar, warm, and entirely predictable. And then came the scream. It tore through the air with such force that it silenced everything. The music, the laughter, even the birds. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Teacups froze halfway to mouths. The maid, who had just reached down for the broken china, stood up too quickly and dropped a plate. From behind the rhododendron hedge, near the potting shed at the garden's edge, a young girl emerged, stumbling over the roots and flowering shrubs. It was Lucy Gage, the vicar's niece, her usual neat appearance in disarray. Her hat was askew, one glove missing, and her white summer dress streaked with dirt. Her face, pale beneath her freckles, was frozen in horror. There's a body, she gasped, eyes wide and wild. Behind the potting shed, a woman. She's dead. The silence that followed was more complete than any scream. It was as though the garden itself had been muted, every breath held back by invisible hands. Then came the chaos. Mrs. Ridgewell fainted outright, crumpling onto the grass with a soft sigh. Colonel Pembroke barked for someone to fetch the constable, immediately, while the vicar stumbled over his cassock trying to calm Lucy. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's hand with surprising strength. Miss Marple rose with the grace of someone decades younger. She did not rush. She never rushed. Instead, she calmly handed her untouched tea to a stunned maid and turned her eyes towards the potting shed. As the guests surged in a disorganized crowd, many heading around the house to the garden's rear, Miss Marple chose a side path through the topiary arch, her soft-soled shoes making little sound on the flagstone. Her eyes flicked over details that others missed. The broken sprig of rosemary near the gate, the faint smudge of red on the garden glove, dropped on the ground, the way Mr. Arbuthnot, having just emerged from the drawing-room, stood utterly still, not moving to follow the others. He wasn't surprised. That was the thought that settled quietly but firmly into Miss Marple's mind. Giles Arbuthnot wasn't surprised. He wasn't horrified, or confused, or eager to play the role of alarmed host. He looked contained. She reached the back of the shed a moment later, and saw the body lying half-concealed behind a low stack of flower pots and overturned gardening tools. A woman, face upturned to the sky, her neck at an unnatural angle. Her auburn hair was pinned in the old-fashioned way, parted at the crown, and rolled into a bun, though now strands had come loose, falling across her face. Her gloved hand was clenched tightly around something. Miss Marple could not yet see what. Her other hand lay open, a slight smear of soil beneath the fingernails. The constable, young Edwin Butterley, finally arrived, breathless, red-faced, and wholly unprepared. he immediately began asking for everyone to, "Please, step back, this is a crime scene now," as if saying it enough times would bring order to the chaos. Miss Marple stood quietly beside Lucy, who had sunk onto a bench, still trembling. "Do you know her?" she asked gently. Lucy shook her head. I don't think so, but she looked familiar, like someone from the village, but older. Maybe she was visiting someone." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then she leaned down and murmured, "Thank you, dear. You were very brave." She turned, her gaze back to the body. There was something about the woman's face, not just the horror of sudden death, but a kind of recognition, as if in the final moment she had seen the face of someone she knew, and the realization had been worse than the act itself. As the villagers swarmed and speculated, Miss Marple remained still. A storm was about to break over the genteel world of St. Mary Mead, and she intended to be ready. Section 2. The Village Reacts. St. Mary Mead had always prided itself on two things: its unwavering civility and its unrivalled ability to dissect any scandal with surgical precision. By the time the body was carried away under a hastily arranged canvas sheet, some 3 hours after Lucy Gage's scream shattered the garden's tranquillity, the rumours had already grown roots. Who was the woman? Why was she on their side of the hedgerow? Was it suicide? A lover's quarrel? A long-lost cousin come to claim her fortune? The guests left in waves, some in silence, others in breathless clusters of conversation that hushed every time Miss Marple passed near. And she passed often, quietly, gently, collecting expressions and overheard mutterings the way others might collect stamps. By sunset, Fernwood stood empty again, the bunting hanging limp and forgotten in the cooling air. The scent of rosewater and cake curdled into something strangely stale. The next morning dawned grey and unsettled. A light drizzle swept through the village, spattering the windows of the post office, running in thin rivulets down the chapel doors, and pooling beneath the crooked eaves of the High Street. Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible grey coat, and with a modestly feathered hat pinned firmly to her silver curls, made her way to the bakery. Inside, the scent of fresh currant buns and warm rye competed with the low hum of voices. Mrs. Annette Sims, the baker's wife, was wiping her hands on a flour-speckled apron as Miss Marple entered. "Well now, Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice, though there were only 2 other customers present. "Quite the stir yesterday, wasn't it? Poor Lucy! Imagine stumbling across something like that." Miss Marple offered a small nod, already reaching into her handbag for her coin purse. She was very brave. Not everyone would have had the presence of mind to run for help. "Still trembling when she came in for tea?" said Mrs. Sims. "You ask me. It's a wonder she didn't faint outright." "I suspect the shock has yet to settle," said Miss Marple. She placed her money down with precise fingers. "One of your brown loaves, please, unsliced." Mrs. Sims nodded, but her curiosity was barely restrained. "They say she had gloves on, the woman," she added, lowering her voice further. "And pearls? Who wears pearls to sneak into a garden?" "A very good question," said Miss Marple, mildly, accepting the loaf and slipping it into her shopping basket. though of course one cannot know why a woman might dress as she does, unless one knows the woman herself. And that's the odd part, isn't it?" Mrs. Sims said. "No one seems to know her, not even Constable Butterley. And he's met everyone from Cheadle to Marchford." Said Miss Marple. "Well, the truth, in my experience, has a habit of surfacing if given time and the right questions." She turned to go, but not before noticing the brief flash of annoyance on the face of Mr. Lenwood, the butcher's son, who had just entered with his delivery cart still parked outside in the drizzle. He nodded tersely to her, but his ears were pink, and he avoided her gaze. Curious, thought Miss Marple. Later that day, the drawing-room of Miss Marple's neat cottage on Old Mill Lane was filled with a quiet ticking from the carriage clock on the mantel. She sat near the window, her knitting once again abandoned in her lap. A small pot of tea steamed gently beside her, and in the wing-back chair opposite sat Inspector Dermot Cray, a man in his late 30s with careful eyes and a quiet tread. "Thank you for seeing me, Miss Marple," he said after a moment. "I know yesterday must have been difficult." "Oh, I shouldn't say difficult," she replied calmly. "Disturbing, of course, but not entirely surprising." The inspector raised one brow. "You suspected something?" "I suspected someone," she said. "Or rather, I suspected that something about Mr. Arbuthnot didn't quite align with the character he presented. One notices such things." Cray smiled faintly. "I don't doubt it. Your instincts are well known to the department, which is precisely why I'm here." He opened his notebook. "The woman's name was Lydia Merrow," he said. "We identified her through a brooch hidden in the lining of her glove. A family crest, traced to a long-defunct estate in Devon. She once worked as a private secretary to Lavinia Templeton. Left under unfortunate circumstances, though, there's nothing official on record. Vanished entirely 5 years ago." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And now she returns to Fernwood, dressed for a formal occasion, and ends up dead behind the potting shed," Cray finished. "Strangled. No defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, nothing missing from her handbag, which we found buried in a flower-bed nearby. A single train ticket from Paddington, one way." Miss Marple sipped her tea. She meant to confront someone then, likely about something old and perhaps quite dangerous. "I believe so." He leaned forward slightly. "Did you notice anything else yesterday? Anything unusual?" "I noticed Mr. Arbuthnot didn't ask who the woman was," she said quietly. "He asked if anyone else had seen her." Cray froze mid-note. "That's specific." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "He also never asked whether she was dead, only that the body was being handled discreetly. Which tells me, Inspector, that Mr. Arbuthnot knew who she was, or at the very least recognized her." The inspector nodded, thoughtfully. "Anything else?" Miss Marple considered. "Only the look in her eyes. She was surprised, but not terrified. Not until the last second. Which means she knew the killer. Perhaps even trusted them. She wouldn't have worn gloves and pearls for a stranger." Cray closed his notebook. "We'll speak to Arbuthnot today, though I doubt he'll say much without cause." "Oh, he won't," said Miss Marple with a faint smile. "But there are others who might." That evening, as dusk began to settle over the village, Miss Marple made one last stop, the vicarage. Lucy Gage sat on the stone bench near the pond, her knees pulled up, a worn blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, managing a small smile. "I hoped you'd come," she said. Miss Marple sat beside her, her hands folded gently over her handbag. "How are you feeling, dear?" "Still shaken," Lucy admitted. "I can't stop seeing her face." "I know," Miss Marple said softly. "Tell me, when you found her, were you alone?" Lucy nodded. "I wandered off. I'd been chasing after Edward's dog, Huxley. He went tearing after a rabbit and slipped through the gate near the compost heap. I followed and ended up by the shed. That's when I saw her." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did you notice anything else?" "Anything strange," Lucy thought. "Yes. Just before I screamed, I thought I heard someone walking away, very soft. Footsteps on wet leaves. I assumed it was someone from the party. But they didn't run, just walked, like they weren't in a hurry, like they knew I'd scream." Miss Marple nodded, the chill of the evening air seeping into her bones, though her eyes remained bright. "Thank you, Lucy. That's very helpful." As she walked home beneath the soft chime of the chapel bell, Miss Marple's mind moved in its usual precise rhythm. A dead woman with secrets. A returning master with too many questions unasked. And someone nearby who had watched the whole thing unfold with quiet feet and deadly intent. She was no closer to naming the killer, but she could already sense the shape of the truth rising, slowly, like a figure in fog. And she knew the real story had only just begun. Section 3. A Visit to Fernwood. The morning after Miss Marple's conversation with Lucy Gage was crisp and clear. The sun had finally broken through the low cloud cover, casting long shadows on the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead. The village, always a picture of peace, seemed somehow darker today, its air thick with the quiet anticipation of something unfinished, unsaid. Miss Marple, however, was undeterred by the weather or the town's murmurs. She had work to do. Fernwood House stood at the very edge of the village, its ivy-covered facade now looking more like an old sleeping creature than a home. The sprawling estate was a relic of a time long past, grand, stately, and filled with secrets. The Gage family had once entertained the county's elite in its drawing rooms, but now it had fallen into a quiet decline, maintained with only the barest attention. The house, much like its owners, had seen better days. When Miss Marple arrived, at the front gate it was still locked, unusual for a property that usually opened itself to visitors with a welcoming, though unremarkable, hospitality. She had planned on visiting the house to speak with its current master, Edward Gage, but the gate's deliberate closure suggested the owner was not in the mood for company. Her eyes, sharp as ever, caught the movement of a figure at the window. Edward, she assumed, peering down at her with that familiar look of suspicion that seemed to colour all of his interactions. As she stood at the entrance, Miss Marple took a moment to adjust the brooch on her coat, a gift from a cousin long forgotten, and then lifted her gloved hand to knock. The door opened before she had a chance, revealing the butler, Mr. Langford, a man who had worked at Fernwood for as long as anyone could remember. Tall, thin, with a perpetually bored expression, he was a fixture in the village, His presence seemed to make everything seem normal, even now, after the shocking events of the previous day. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Langford said, his voice rich with polite disinterest. "I trust you're here for the matter of yesterday's unfortunate incident?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied, offering a gentle smile. "I had hoped to speak with Mr. Gage. Mr. Gage is otherwise occupied, I'm afraid," Langford replied smoothly, but there was an odd hesitation in his tone, something that Miss Marple did not miss. "He is in his study, but I believe he would prefer not to be disturbed at this time." "I see," Miss Marple said, her expression unmoving. "But you see, Mr. Langford, I have a particular interest in speaking with him about the matter. His insight would be invaluable, I'm sure." Langford's gaze flickered briefly, a barely perceptible shift in his posture. "I will inform him of your visit," he said, stepping aside to allow Miss Marple inside. There was no sense of welcome in the gesture, but it was an opening nonetheless. The interior of Fernwood House was as expected. Dark wood panelling, heavy velvet curtains, and old portraits lining the walls. Portraits of people who, if Miss Marple had to guess, were long gone. She knew from previous visits that Gage's father had passed some years ago, and the estate had since been maintained by Edward, his only son, a man whose temperament had soured with the passing of his family's fortune. Miss Marple was led down a long hallway, where the faint smell of tobacco and old paper lingered in the air. As she passed a small library, she caught a glimpse of Mr. Gage himself, standing by a tall window with his back to her, staring out into the garden, hands clasped behind his back. Edward Gage was a man of average height and build, though he carried himself with an air of quiet authority that made him seem taller. His suit was impeccable, dark, tailored and expensive, but there was a weariness to his posture, as though he had long been carrying a weight no one could see. His thick dark hair, just beginning to show streaks of grey at the temples, was neatly combed, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, seemed perpetually on edge. "Mr. Gage," Miss Marple said softly, her voice smooth and unthreatening. Turned slowly, his expression unreadable, but his gaze flickered with the faintest hint of surprise. It was the kind of surprise one experienced when caught off guard, but not necessarily in a bad way. "Miss Marple," he replied, his tone colder than she had anticipated. "I'm not sure what more there is to say. I believe you've already heard everything necessary. A woman died in my garden. There are no answers to that, not yet. I would argue there are many answers," Miss Marple said gently. "And while I do understand the confusion, I'm afraid I have a few more questions for you. If you would indulge me, Mr. Gage." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Very well, but I won't pretend to have much of an appetite for this." "Of course," she said, settling herself in one of the plush chairs by the hearth. She didn't immediately sit, though, waiting instead for Gage to choose whether or not to join her. He finally slumped into the opposite chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. "What is it you need, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice lacking warmth, but not entirely dismissive. "Simply to understand," she said. "You were present at the garden party yesterday, I believe." "I was, yes," he answered tersely. "And you were the one to see the body first?" He nodded. "And did you see anyone else before you? Perhaps someone who may have left earlier, or whose presence struck you as odd?" Gage's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening on the chair's arm. "No, I didn't see anyone else. No one. Why do you ask such questions, Miss Marple? What are you implying?" Miss Marple's gaze softened, the sharpness of her words counterbalanced by the calm of her demeanour. "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Gage. I simply observe. There's no harm in asking questions, is there?" He said nothing for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers, before he finally spoke. "You believe I know something more than I've let on?" "I believe you know something," Miss Marple said, softly. "But perhaps you're not the one who should be worried." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of rain tapping on the windows. Edward Gage, usually so composed, suddenly seemed tired, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of the conversation had finally begun to sink in. "Do you mind if I ask what you intend to do with your understanding, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly flat. "I intend to understand everything, Mr. Gage," Miss Marple said, standing slowly. "And once I do, I will be happy to share my conclusions with the authorities." He nodded slowly, almost as though relieved that Miss Marple wasn't demanding immediate answers. The suspicion that had been in the air just moments before dissipated as she made her way toward the door. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Gage," she said, offering him a polite smile. "I'm sure we'll be seeing much of each other in the coming days." Gage said nothing, his expression unreadable, but his fingers drummed again on the armrest as Miss Marple left. Outside, the rain had begun to fall heavier, soaking through Miss Marple's coat as she made her way back to the village. Fernwood House, now disappearing behind the thick mist, seemed to whisper its own secrets. Secrets that Miss Marple had no intention of leaving uncovered. As she passed by the fountain, a figure in the distance caught her eye. It was Langford, the butler, again. This time he was standing near the garden gate, watching her intently, his face hidden in the shadows of a nearby tree. Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. Sometimes the more a person tried to hide, the more they revealed, and, as always, Miss Marple could read the unspoken truth better than most. Section 4. First Suspects. The quiet stillness of St. Mary Mead had been shattered by the discovery of a murder in the heart of the village. What had once been an ordinary, if somewhat uneventful day, had become the talk of the town. The whispers seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. As more people speculated, more theories were concocted, and more faces appeared to be scrutinized with a level of intensity that the village had never known. At the centre of it all stood Miss Marple, whose gentle manner belied a razor-sharp mind. As she sat in her favourite chair, knitting quietly, in her sitting-room, she observed the world around her with a clarity few could match. The village may have been a small and peaceful place, but it was full of complex human nature, secrets, resentments and desires that even the most innocuous of smiles could hide. It was a few days after her visit to Fernwood House that Miss Marple found herself in the village square once more. The gossip was reaching a fever pitch. The Gages, already a family with a somewhat tarnished reputation, were now the focal point of every conversation. People who had once claimed to be their closest friends now spoke of them in low, conspiratorial tones. There was Edward Gage, of course, who everyone seemed to agree had an air of nervousness about him. He was certainly under pressure. He had, inherited a struggling estate, a faltering reputation, and a household that seemed to be unravelling by the day. Then there was Lucy Gage, his wife, who was being quietly shielded from the worst of the rumours. She was a reserved woman, not given to public displays of emotion, and her calm demeanour had made her a figure of intrigue in the eyes of the villagers. Some speculated that it was her cold nature that had pushed Edward to the edge. Others hinted that her aloofness might hide a darker side. And of course, there was the enigmatic Mrs. Delphine Gage, Edward's aunt, a woman of indeterminate age, who had lived at Fernwood for as long as anyone could remember. The fact that she was so often seen, yet never quite understood, had made her a prime subject for idle gossip. A figure of mystery, Mrs. Gage's presence at Fernwood was less a matter of choice and more a matter of family obligation. But, as always, Miss Marple's approach was not to focus on the surface details. While the villagers busied themselves with their assumptions, she preferred to take a closer look at the inner workings of the Gage household and the people within it, and so she had spent the days following her visit to Fernwood House, observing the residents of the village, watching how they interacted, and listening to their words. It wasn't long before a name began to surface. Sylvia Bellamy. Sylvia Bellamy was the headstrong, opinionated daughter of the local vicar, a young woman with a sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She had long been known to flirt with trouble, often pushing boundaries where others would prefer to keep the peace. Miss Marple had often observed Sylvia from afar, noting her unflinching boldness. In a village as staid as St. Mary Mead, Sylvia's lack of fear was both intriguing and unsettling. The villagers whispered about her relationship with Edward Gage. Some said they were once in love, but that the romance had faded in the wake of Gage's marriage to Lucy. Others spoke of a simmering rivalry between the two women, fueled by jealousy and old wounds. No one knew for sure, but it was clear that Sylvia had a connection to Fernwood House that went beyond mere acquaintance. Miss Marple had seen Sylvia just that morning, walking briskly through the village square, her head held high, her eyes focused ahead with a look of purpose. She had barely acknowledged anyone's presence, a stark contrast to her usual gregarious self. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking along the lane toward the vicarage, which stood a little farther from the heart of the village. It was there that she intended to visit Sylvia, whose sudden moodiness Miss Marple had found puzzling. The vicarage was an old house, quaint but worn with the years. Miss Marple rang the doorbell and was soon greeted by the vicar himself, a man whose gentle demeanour could never quite hide the underlying impatience that bubbled just beneath the surface. "Ah, Miss Marple," the vicar said warmly, ushering her inside. "I trust you're here for one of your usual chats with Sylvia." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied with her typical calm. "I understand she has been quite upset these past few days. I thought perhaps I might offer a bit of company." The vicar gave her a knowing smile. "She's been in a bit of a state, that's true. I'm sure she'll appreciate the distraction. But do be gentle with her, Miss Marple. You know how she can be." "I'll be sure to tread carefully," Miss Marple said with a gentle smile of her own. The vicar led her to the sitting-room, where Sylvia sat by the fire, a glass of wine in hand. The younger woman looked up at Miss Marple as she entered, her face a picture of carefully controlled emotion. "Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice a little too bright, a little too rehearsed. "How lovely to see you. Please do sit. I could use the company." Miss Marple took a seat across from Sylvia, folding her hands neatly in her lap as she observed the young woman. Sylvia's movements were sharp, deliberate. Her every action seemed to scream tension, but she hid it behind a mask of cordiality. "Tell me, Sylvia, how have you been?" Miss Marple asked in her soft, disarming voice. Sylvia hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering away from Miss Marple's gaze. "Oh, you know," she said airily, "things are difficult. The village is all in a stir about poor Mrs. Gage. Everyone's got their theories, of course. It's all terribly dramatic, don't you think?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Yes, it's certainly a most unfortunate event. But surely you must have your own thoughts, Sylvia. You were quite close with the Gages, were you not?" Sylvia's eyes narrowed just the slightest bit, but the reaction was fleeting. "I suppose so," she said, her voice tightening. "But I don't think it's any of my business now. Mrs. Gage is dead, and Edward's made his bed. The rest of us will just have to deal with the aftermath." "I see," Miss Marple said. "It must be difficult to see things unravel this way. No one likes to feel helpless in the face of tragedy." Sylvia's fingers tightened around the glass of wine, but she quickly relaxed her grip. "Indeed," she said, her tone now laced with a quiet bitterness. "Helplessness is the word. Edward could have done so much, but he did nothing. And now we all must pay for it." Miss Marple watched her closely. There was something in Sylvia's eyes, something that spoke of more than just bitterness. It spoke of loss, of a deeper hurt. "And what exactly is it that we're paying for, Sylvia?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but probing. Sylvia's smile was tight, strained. "Oh, you know, secrets. Old secrets that have a way of coming back to haunt us. But of course, you're much too clever to miss that, aren't you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple let the silence stretch, her gaze unwavering. "Secrets, you say?" she murmured. "How intriguing!" Sylvia's eyes flickered momentarily, a shadow crossing her face before she regained her composure. "Well, Miss Marple, you'll hear all about them soon enough, I suppose. No one's really immune, are they?" As she spoke, Miss Marple felt a subtle shift in the room. Sylvia, for all her bravado, had just revealed more than she intended, and Miss Marple, with her impeccable skill for reading people, knew that the young woman's words held far more weight than she had let on. Later that evening, Miss Marple stood outside the vicarage, watching the fading light as the village began to settle into twilight. She had learned much from Sylvia, though not through the woman's direct admissions. It was in the pauses, the carefully controlled moments, that Miss Marple had found the most valuable clues. Sylvia Bellamy's bitterness was not just a reaction to Edward Gage's marriage. It ran much deeper. Miss Marple could sense that Sylvia had been part of something hidden, something she might never admit aloud, but something Miss Marple was beginning to piece together. The evening air was cool as Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage. She knew that the first few layers of the mystery had begun to peel away, but beneath them more questions remained, questions she intended to answer, and with each answer the shadows surrounding Fernwood House seemed to grow darker. Section 5. A hidden clue. The days passed, and the mood in St. Mary Mead grew more oppressive. What had begun as a single tragic event now seemed to spiral into something far more sinister. With each new whisper and each new theory, the village had become a crucible of suspicion and unease. But Miss Marple, as always, remained composed. Her observations were sharp, her mind focused. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly, methodically falling into place. She spent the next few days in quiet observation, paying visits to various corners of the village and gathering information. Her visits were subtle, a quick exchange of pleasantries. Here, a casual chat with an acquaintance there. All the while, she observed the behaviour of the key players, the Gages, Sylvia Bellamy, and even the villagers who had been closest to the family. She was like a spider, weaving a web of information and connecting the threads in a way that no one else could see. Miss Marple's most recent visit had been to the Gage family estate, Fernwood House. The place was quieter now, less vibrant than it had been in the days before the murder. Edward Gage had been reclusive, rarely seen outside the house, while his wife Lucy had retreated into a shell of silence. Miss Marple had spoken to their maid, a nervous woman named Clara, who had provided little more than nervous glances and fragmented accounts of the night of the murder. There was something about Clara that Miss Marple found intriguing, but it would require further investigation to untangle what lay beneath the surface. It was late one afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in her parlour with a cup of tea, that the breakthrough came. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. The quiet hum of the village seemed to be at its peak, an almost eerie calm before the storm. It was then that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Sylvia Bellamy appeared at her door, her face pale and drawn. She entered without waiting for an invitation, a look of quiet desperation in her eyes. "Miss Marple," Sylvia began, her voice strained, "I need to talk to you. There's something you need to know, something important." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "Of course, my dear. Please sit down. What is it that's troubling you?" Sylvia hesitated for a moment, wringing her hands together. Her usual bravado was gone. There was something raw in her demeanour, a hint of fear that hadn't been there before. "I've been trying to ignore it, Miss Marple," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "But I can't any more. You were right. There's something I haven't told you, something that I thought would be better left forgotten. But it's all coming back now, and I can't keep silent any longer." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sympathy, though her mind raced, trying to piece together what Sylvia was about to reveal. "It's about Fernwood House," Sylvia continued, her eyes flickering nervously toward the window. "There's something you don't know, something that was hidden from everyone. Edward is hiding something, and so is his aunt, Mrs. Gage." Miss Marple remained silent, waiting for Sylvia to continue. She knew that Sylvia was on the brink of saying something important. But what, exactly? "I know you're trying to understand. What happened?" Sylvia went on, her words coming faster now. "But it wasn't just a random murder. Mrs. Gage wasn't just killed by some intruder. No, it was planned. And Edward knows more than he's letting on." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Planned?" she asked softly. "Do you know who did it, Sylvia?" Sylvia shook her head. "No, I don't know. But I know that Edward and Mrs. Gage were involved in something. It was something secretive, something no one was supposed to find out about. She paused, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I overheard them, you see. I was at Fernwood House one night visiting, and I overheard them talking. Edward and his aunt. They were arguing about something. I didn't hear all of it, but I heard enough. They were worried about something they had hidden for years. Miss Marple leaned forward, her interest piqued. What were they worried about, Sylvia? What secret were they hiding? Sylvia's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she feared someone might overhear. It was about money, lots of it. Edward's inheritance. Mrs. Gage had kept something from him. She was controlling everything, and he was desperate to get his hands on it. There were threats, Miss Marple, threats of disinheritance, and Sylvia hesitated, biting her lip as though she were unsure whether to continue. And what else, Sylvia? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but insistent. Sylvia swallowed hard before continuing. There was talk of another family, a family that was connected to the Gages in some way. I didn't understand it all, but I could hear enough. I overheard Mrs. Gage say that if Edward didn't do something soon, they would lose everything. Miss Marple's mind raced. The pieces were beginning to come together. This wasn't just a murder. It was tied to a long-standing family secret, one that involved both money and something far more personal. Miss Marple needed more information, and she needed it quickly. Sylvia, Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm, I need you to tell me everything you remember from that night. Every detail, no matter how small. Sylvia nodded, her face pale. I'll tell you everything I can remember. But please, Miss Marple, you have to find out the truth, the whole truth. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire in her sitting room, her thoughts turning over the revelations Sylvia had made. She had heard enough to know that the murder was tied to something far deeper than a mere family dispute. It involved money, secrets, and possibly even blackmail. But there was still so much she didn't know, so much that was hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. There was one thing Miss Marple knew for certain. Edward Gage was not the helpless victim. He appeared to be, and Sylvia Bellamy, with her boldness and her ties to the family, was more involved in the mystery than anyone had initially realized. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mrs. Gage, Edward's aunt. She had always been a figure of quiet control, but Miss Marple was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Gage had been more than just a stern matriarch. She had been a key player in the secrets that had been kept hidden for so long. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would pay another visit to Fernwood House. She would speak to Clara, the maid, once more, and perhaps even see if she could unearth something the others had overlooked. There was still one piece of the puzzle that had yet to be uncovered, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. Section 6. The Truth Behind the Veil. The next morning Miss Marple rose early, the quiet hum of the village life outside her window. As usual, her mind was sharp, and her thoughts whirred with the new information Sylvia had revealed. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place, yet something still didn't quite make sense. Mrs. Gage's sudden death, the secret family matters, the inheritance. There was more to this story than a simple dispute over money. She prepared for her visit to Fernwood House. Miss Marple considered her next move. Sylvia had mentioned a hidden family, one that seemed connected to the Gages, though its exact nature was still a mystery. Was it a shadow family? One that had been cast aside by Mrs. Gage's iron grip on the family fortune? Or was there a more personal reason behind the estrangement? Fernwood House was quieter than ever as Miss Marple arrived. The grounds were meticulously kept, the gardens pristine, yet there was an air of sombreness about the estate. Edward Gage had been keeping to himself, and the staff seemed just as withdrawn, their expressions guarded, as if something dark lurked beneath their polished facades. Miss Marple made her way to the kitchen, where Clara, the maid, was tidying up. The girl looked up, her face pale, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. Miss Marple had always been able to read people, and Clara's discomfort was obvious. "Good morning, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice as calm and gentle as ever. "I was hoping we could have a little chat about the night of Mrs. Gage's death." Clara looked down at the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down the counter. I don't know much, Miss Marple. I only know what I was told." "You know more than you think," Miss Marple said softly. "I've been speaking with Sylvia Bellamy, and she mentioned overhearing a conversation between Edward and Mrs. Gage. A conversation about a family secret." Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to appear behind her. I don't know anything about that," she said quickly, "but I did hear something strange the night of the murder. It was just after I finished cleaning the sitting room and was heading up to bed. I heard voices, low, angry voices." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Whose voices did you hear, Clara?" "I'm not sure, Miss Marple, but I think one of them was Edward's. I could hear him shouting about something to do with money. Then there was a loud thud, like something heavy had been knocked over. I didn't dare go closer. But I heard Edward leave the house soon after, and Mrs. Gage, she was lying on the floor when I found her." A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. The details Clara provided were important. They painted a clearer picture of the events that had unfolded the night of Mrs. Gage's death. Edward had been involved in some kind of argument, and the sounds Clara described suggested a struggle. Could it be that Edward had lost control? In a fit of rage? Did Edward seem upset when he left the house? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. Clara bit her lip. He looked like he had seen a ghost, Miss Marple. He was pale, and his eyes were wide, like he was in shock. I didn't say anything to him, but I remember wondering what had happened. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the new information. Edward had been shaken, perhaps even genuinely horrified by what had occurred. But had he been the one to kill his aunt, or was there something else at play here? "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice warm but firm. "You've been very helpful. Now I must speak with Edward." Clara seemed relieved, but her eyes lingered on Miss Marple as she left the kitchen. The maid seemed to know more than she was willing to admit, but for now that would have to wait. Miss Marple's next step was to confront Edward Gage. Edward Gage was waiting for her in the study, his posture stiff and his face unreadable. He had the look of a man who had been forced into a corner, guilty, yet trying to maintain a facade of innocence. "Miss Marple," he said in a low, strained voice, standing to greet her. "I didn't expect you to come here today." Miss Marple smiled politely, but there was something in her eyes that made Edward uneasy. "I do hope you'll forgive my unexpected visit," she said, "but there are still many things that remain unclear about the night your aunt passed away. Perhaps you could shed some light on them for me." Edward hesitated, his gaze flicking to the window as if searching for an escape. He was clearly agitated, and Miss Marple could tell that he was holding back. "Miss Marple, Edward began, but his words faltered. He cleared his throat. "You must understand, I loved my aunt dearly, but she was a difficult woman. She never let me have control over my own life. Always there, always watching me." Miss Marple nodded, though she kept her thoughts to herself. "I understand that family can be complicated," she said gently. "But the night of her death, you were heard arguing with her. What was that argument about, Edward?" Edward's face paled, and for a moment he looked as though he might collapse. His hands clenched into fists, and he stared at the floor. "It was about money," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was planning to disinherit me, Miss Marple. After all the years I had been taking care of her, she was going to give everything to someone else, someone outside the family. I was desperate. I needed that money." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. "And was that when things got out of hand? When the argument escalated?" Edward looked up at her, his eyes wild with guilt. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt her. But in the heat of the moment, I lost control. There was a struggle, and I pushed her. She fell. I swear, I didn't intend to kill her." Miss Marple sat back, her mind processing his words. Edward had not killed his aunt out of malice, but in a moment of fury. He had been desperate, and desperation often led to tragic consequences. But there was something that didn't sit right with her. "You're telling me the truth, Edward," Miss Marple said softly, "but I believe there's something more you're hiding. You're not the only one who had a motive. There's more to this story, more than just a fight over money." Edward looked at her in confusion, but Miss Marple simply smiled and stood up. "I believe the full truth will come to light soon enough." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room, her thoughts turning to the clues that had surfaced over the past few days. Edward's confession had been a piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't the entire picture. There was still one more part to uncover, the hidden family Sylvia had spoken of, the one tied to the Gages' long-buried secrets. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would return to the estate to search for the truth, armed with the knowledge that the Gages' secrets were far from over. Section 6. A Revelation in the Shadows. The following day dawned clear and bright, though the sun seemed to shine without its usual warmth. There was a certain tension in the air, one that lingered in the corners of every room in Fernwood House. Miss Marple, however, was not easily intimidated by atmosphere. As she made her way toward the estate, her mind was alive with theories, each one more intricate than the last. Edward's confession about his desperate fight with his aunt had been compelling, but there was something about the circumstances of Mrs. Gage's death that didn't quite add up. There was more to this story, and Miss Marple was determined to find it. The previous evening, she had spent a quiet hour reflecting on the case, reviewing every piece of information she had gathered. One detail stood out: the reference to a hidden family member that Sylvia had hinted at. Sylvia herself had been tight-lipped about who this person was, but Miss Marple could not ignore the significance of such a mention. If there were a secret, family member, someone excluded from the Gage family's affairs, then they must have a motive to act. There was another detail that she could not shake off. The way Clara had described Edward's behaviour after the argument with his aunt. The man was disturbed, visibly shaken, yes, but was that the mark of someone who had accidentally killed his relative? Or was it the mark of a man who was trying to cover up a more sinister truth? Miss Marple arrived at Fernwood House just as the bells of the village church struck the hour. She was greeted by the butler, who led her into the drawing-room, where Edward Gage sat by the fireplace, looking somewhat apprehensive. "Miss Marple," he said, standing up quickly, his eyes darting toward the door as if hoping for an escape. "What can I do for you today?" "I believe we need to talk again, Mr. Gage," Miss Marple replied in her usual gentle tone. "There's still something you haven't told me. Something important." She paused, watching him carefully as she made her way to the armchair opposite him. Edward shifted uncomfortably, and for the first time Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in his hand. He had always been a man who prided himself on his composure, but now his facade seemed to be cracking just a little. "I've already told you everything I know," Edward said, his voice growing defensive. "What more do you want from me?" I don't believe you've told me everything," Miss Marple replied softly, her gaze unwavering. "You see, Edward, there's something very interesting about your aunt's will. It's not just about money. It's about family. There's a connection here, something hidden beneath the surface." Edward's expression faltered, but only for a moment. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to hide his unease behind a mask of irritation. "My aunt's will is straightforward. It was all about the inheritance, the estate. I'm sure you've seen it by now." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes glinting with quiet understanding. "Oh, I've seen it. But what I didn't see was a mention of someone else, a family member who, I believe, has been deliberately excluded from the will." Edward went pale. His mouth worked as if he was trying to speak, but could find no words. Finally he managed to mutter, "You're wrong. There's no one else. No one." "You so certain?" Miss Marple asked, her voice low and thoughtful. "Tell me, Edward, do you know a woman by the name of Evelyn Larkin?" The name seemed to strike Edward like a physical blow. His eyes widened, and for a moment he looked as though he might collapse. He swallowed hard, then clenched his fists in his lap. I don't know what you mean. That name, it means nothing." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from his face. "It means something, Edward. It means something important. Evelyn Larkin was once very close to your family, wasn't she? So close, in fact, that she might be considered part of it, until something happened. Something that caused her to be cast aside, perhaps due to jealousy or betrayal. She must have been excluded, for a reason that involves more than just money. The truth about her has been kept hidden, hasn't it?" Edward's face twisted with a mixture of anger and fear. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence between them stretched, and Miss Marple could feel the tension in the room growing thicker. Edward seemed to be struggling with something, perhaps the guilt of a long-forgotten sin, or the weight of a family secret he was not yet ready to confront. "You've been hiding something from me, Edward," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice soft but insistent. "And I believe that the key to Mrs. Gage's death lies in the shadows of this family secret. Evelyn Larkin, whoever she may be, holds the answer." At this, Edward's face crumpled, and for the first time he seemed to break down entirely. His eyes filled with tears, and his hands shook as he gripped the arm of the chair. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said, his voice breaking. Evelyn was my sister, Miss Marple, my half-sister to be precise. She was born of an affair my father had many years ago, but she was never acknowledged by my mother. She wasn't even allowed to carry the Gage name. And when my aunt found out about her, she made it clear that Evelyn was not to be part of the family. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her thoughts turning over the new revelation. A half-sister. The same person who had been excluded from the family, hidden away for years, and now, apparently, connected to the tragic events surrounding Mrs. Gage's death. Evelyn had been rejected, erased, and the memory of her had haunted the Gage family for decades. "Did you ever meet her?" Miss Marple asked gently. Edward nodded, his face clouded with sorrow. "Yes, I did. As a child, she was the sweetest, most loving girl, but my mother hated her with a passion. And after my father died, my aunt took over everything. She made sure Evelyn had no place in the family, no place in Fernwood House. I didn't want to lose her, Miss Marple, but I didn't know how to help her. I was young, too young to challenge my aunt's authority." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she processed this new information. Evelyn had been a victim of the Gage family's rigid hierarchy, rejected because of her mother's affair. But rejection often bred resentment, and resentment in turn bred revenge. Had Evelyn returned to claim what was hers? Had her return been the catalyst for the murder? "Where is she now?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't know," Edward said, his voice trembling. "I haven't seen her in years, but I know she's still alive. I've tried to forget about her, Miss Marple, but I can't escape the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for something." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. The pieces of the puzzle. Evelyn was the key, and Miss Marple was certain that the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the local archives. Her mind focused on the names and dates she had uncovered. If Evelyn Larkin was indeed the answer, then she would need to find more. The family's past was entwined with lies, secrets, and forgotten promises, and somewhere, hidden beneath the layers of deception, the truth waited to be discovered. She pulled out a dusty old ledger from the shelf and began to read. And there it was, the name she had been searching for, Evelyn Larkin, the forgotten daughter of Thomas Gage, the missing link. And with that, the final clue had been found. The end was near. Section 8. The Final Confrontation. The evening had fallen quietly over Fernwood House, and the shadows in the grand hallway seemed to lengthen as Miss Marple stood at the foot of the staircase. She had requested a final meeting with the remaining members of the household, and the hour had come. Her mind was clearer now, the fog of uncertainty lifting, as the weight of truth settled upon her like a heavy cloak. She had pieced together the motives, the family dynamics, and the clues. Each detail now fit into place like the final lock on a well-worn chest. But now it was time to confront the one who had committed the unthinkable. Miss Marple was not in a rush. She moved slowly, methodically, her every step considered. Tonight there would be no dramatic confrontations, no loud accusations. She had learned through years of observation that the most effective revelation was the one that came quietly, with precision and care. The guilty party would reveal themselves not through their words, but through their reactions. As she entered the drawing room, Edward Gage and Clara were already seated. Both looked expectant, though their faces betrayed the anxiety that lay just below the surface. Miss Marple noted the way Clara fidgeted with her hands, nervously folding and unfolding her lace handkerchief, while Edward's gaze flickered from the fire to the window, his posture rigid as if bracing himself for something he already knew was coming. Miss Marple took her place in the chair opposite them, offering a small, understanding smile as she settled herself. She did not speak at once. Instead, she let the silence hang in the air, thick and pregnant with tension. She knew they were both waiting, perhaps hoping for the wrong answer, or fearing the right one. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "I have discovered everything I need to know about Mrs. Gage's death. It was no accident, as some might have believed, and it was not, as others might have hoped, a matter of inheritance or family squabbles." Edward's breath caught in his throat, but he said nothing. Clara, on the other hand, looked down, her face pale. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, her eyes narrowing as she studied their faces, "that Mrs. Gage was murdered because of a secret that has been buried for many years. A secret about a family member, one that was excluded from your lives but never truly forgotten." At this, Clara shifted uneasily in her seat, her fingers now tightly gripping the handkerchief, as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. Edward's face had gone ashen, but he remained silent, his gaze fixed on Miss Marple. "You are right, Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Evelyn Larkin was a part of this family. She was my sister-in-law, and she was rejected by all of us because of the affair my father had with her mother. My Aunt Sylvia was determined to keep the truth about Evelyn's birth hidden, and that was the reason she would never allow her to be part of our lives. I hated Evelyn for a long time. I hated the fact that she had a place in this family that I would never have." She paused, her face twisting with a mixture of guilt and frustration. "But I never wanted her dead." Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly, but she did not allow her compassion to sway her judgment. "No, Clara, I don't believe you wanted Evelyn dead, but there is one person in this room who did." Edward's head jerked up at the words, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "What are you implying?" he demanded, though his voice lacked the usual firmness. "I'm implying," Miss Marple replied, "that the person responsible for Mrs. Gage's death is someone who has been hiding behind a mask of grief, a mask of sorrow, pretending to mourn a loss that they themselves caused." Clara's eyes widened in horror, and she looked toward Edward. You're not suggesting it was Edward, are you?" Edward's lips tightened into a thin line, but he said nothing. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on him, as though she were waiting for the slightest crack in his composure. Edward's hands, which had been clenched in his lap, slowly relaxed, and his head hung low, as though he were preparing to accept the inevitable. But it was Clara who broke the silence. "Edward, no, it can't be you," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You were always so calm, so composed. You never—" "I did it, Clara," Edward interrupted, his voice devoid of emotion, as though he were speaking of something that no longer mattered. "I killed her." The words hung in the air, stark and cold, before Clara could even process what had been said. She blinked as though hoping the reality of the situation would change, but the truth had already been spoken. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Edward. "Why?" Clara finally asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do such a thing? After everything, after all these years?" Edward looked up then, and for the first time in the entire investigation, Miss Marple saw a flicker of emotion in his eyes. It was not guilt or fear, but something darker, something cold and calculated, because of the will, because of Evelyn. She was going to ruin everything. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice now soft but cutting. "Evelyn Larkin came back to claim her inheritance, didn't she? She discovered the truth about her birth, and she knew she was entitled to a share of the Gage estate. She would have revealed everything, exposed your family's secret, and caused a scandal that would have torn this house apart." Edward nodded, the weight of his confession sinking in. "I couldn't let that happen. My aunt had spent her entire life protecting the family's reputation. I couldn't let it all unravel over a woman who had no right to claim what wasn't hers." Clara's face twisted with confusion. "But Edward, you didn't have to kill her. There had to be another way." Edward's eyes darkened as he stared into the flames of the fireplace. "You don't understand. I had to do it. She was going to take everything away from us. And when I saw her at the estate, standing there, so confident and so certain, I just lost control." Miss Marple stood up, her face composed. "And so you killed her. You staged the scene to make it look like an accident, didn't you?" Edward nodded. "I tried to make it look like she had fallen, that she had tripped over the rug. I didn't want anyone to know. But she wasn't supposed to die like that. I didn't plan it." "You took a life to protect your family's reputation," Miss Marple said quietly. "And now you've lost everything in the process." Edward did not respond. His gaze remained fixed, empty, as though the weight of his actions had already consumed him. Clara, however, could barely breathe, the shock of it all still lingering in the air like an unspoken curse. Miss Marple turned toward the door. "I will leave you to your thoughts now. But understand this, Edward. Your actions have consequences, and they will follow you, no matter how hard you try to outrun them." As she left the room, Miss Marple's mind turned once more to the human nature she had spent a lifetime studying. The complexities of love, jealousy, and pride had led to this moment, a tragic end to a family's long-standing secrets. She did not feel pity for Edward, nor did she feel anger, but rather a profound sadness for a life that had been squandered, a potential that had been destroyed by a simple, fatal decision. The village of Fernwood would return to its peaceful routine, the shadows of the past lingering just beneath the surface. And Miss Marple, ever observant, would move on to the next mystery, knowing full well that human nature remained as unpredictable and mysterious as ever. Section 9. The Aftermath. The dawn broke quietly over Fernwood, painting the village in soft, muted hues of pink and gold. The morning mist still clung to the stone cottages, drifting lazily over the cobblestone streets, as if reluctant to give way to the warmth of the sun. The air was cool and crisp, a welcome contrast to the weight of the events that had transpired in the previous days. As usual, Miss Marple was already awake, her routine unchanged despite the unsettling events of the past week. She had always preferred the stillness of early morning, when the world was not yet awake, and thoughts could be gathered without distraction. Today, however, the weight of the case still lingered in her mind. Even now, after all the revelations, she found herself reflecting on the delicate nature of human behaviour, the hidden desires and fears that motivated every action. The previous night had been a quiet one. Edward Gage, under the watchful eye of the local constable, had been taken to the police station. His confession had been met with a strange sort of resignation rather than shock. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, he had known for some time that his own actions would eventually catch up with him. Clara, too, had been sent to her room, and though she had been allowed to stay in the house, her mind was far from at ease. She had not spoken a word since Edward's arrest, her face pale and withdrawn, a look of disbelief still etched into her features. The village of Fernwood had been in a state of quiet turmoil ever since the murder. The scandal had spread through the community like wildfire, though few dared to speak of it openly. Gossip, as always, ran rampant, but it was clear that the townspeople were still too shocked to truly process what had occurred. They spoke of Mrs. Gage with reverence, her death seen as a tragic loss, but no one truly understood the complexities of the family dynamics or the hidden resentments that had festered beneath the surface for years. Miss Marple had, of course, been busy with the aftermath of the investigation. She had spoken to the constable, provided her insights into the case, and even assisted in clearing up a few misunderstandings. But despite the resolution of the murder, something about the case still lingered in her mind. It was early afternoon when Miss Marple received a knock on the door of her cottage. She had not been expecting company, but when she opened it, she was met with the familiar face of Constable Forrester, a young man who had always shown respect for her quiet wisdom. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Constable," Miss Marple replied with a warm smile. "What brings you here today?" "I thought you might like to know that the investigation has been officially closed," Constable Forrester said, stepping inside as Miss Marple gestured for him to take a seat. "Edward Gage has been charged with the murder of his wife. The case is clear now. His confession, along with the evidence we've gathered, leaves no room for doubt." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers lightly tapping against the armrest of her chair. "I suppose that's good news for the village, isn't it? At least they can move on from this tragedy." Forrester paused, his brow furrowed as he considered her words. "Yes, of course, but there's something unsettling about it all. I'm not sure if you've heard, but there's been talk of a more complicated motive behind the murder. Some of the villagers are saying that it wasn't just about the inheritance, that there was something more going on between Edward and his wife, something darker." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh, what sort of talk? They're saying, Forrester continued hesitantly, that Mrs. Gage may have been involved in some sort of affair. A few of the local women have mentioned seeing her with a man who wasn't her husband. It's only gossip, of course, but it's been stirring up quite a bit of speculation. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, considering the new information. It seems that in every case there is always more than meets the eye. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the one that hides the greatest truth. Forrester looked uncertain. Do you think there's more to this case than we know, Miss Marple? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she allowed the silence to fill the room, her eyes distant as she pieced together the new fragments of information. Edward's confession had seemed complete, a perfect match to the evidence. But the constable's words made her wonder, were there other motives at play, hidden beneath layers of family secrets and old grudges? Or was it simply the tragedy of one man's desperation? After a long pause, Miss Marple finally spoke. It's always the simplest explanation that people tend to overlook. But that's not what's troubling me, Constable. What truly concerns me is the way this family has dealt with the consequences of their actions. Edward's confession was clear, but I can't help but feel there's more to his guilt than meets the eye. The shame, the guilt, the hidden resentments, all these things are often so tightly wound together they obscure the truth. Forrester looked at her, a mixture of admiration and confusion on his face. So, you think there's something more to uncover? Miss Marple nodded. It's possible, but sometimes, Constable, the truth is not something we can uncover so easily. It's something we must learn to live with, even when we don't fully understand it. The constable nodded, though his face betrayed his uncertainty. Well, just wanted to let you know that everything is in order now. There won't be any further investigation. Thank you, Constable, Miss Marple said, offering him a warm smile. But, if you don't mind, I think I'll continue to ponder this case for a while longer. There's something about it that still nags at me. The constable stood and made his way to the door. Of course, I know you've a keen mind, Miss Marple. I'm sure you'll figure it out. As he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair, her fingers tracing the edges of her teacup. She could not shake the feeling that there was something in Edward's story that didn't quite add up. His motives, his actions, his confession, they all seemed too neat, too easy. It was almost as if he had expected to be caught, as though he had resigned himself to his fate long before he even committed the crime. The thought lingered in her mind as she sipped her tea, and for the first time in days she felt a quiet unease settle into her bones. There was more to the case, she was sure of it. But sometimes, Miss Marple thought, the answer was something even she couldn't uncover. And yet, she also knew that human nature was never truly hidden. It would reveal itself, sooner or later in its own way. Section X, the final revelation. The days that followed Edward Gage's confession were quiet in Fernwood. The town, still reeling from the murder of Mrs. Gage, began to settle back into its familiar rhythms. The church bells tolled, as they always did. The children returned to their schoolyard games, and the village shopkeepers resumed their morning routines. But there was a strange, lingering discomfort in the air, as though the village could not fully escape the shadows of the tragedy. that had befallen it. Miss Marple had continued her own quiet observation, as was her custom. She had returned to her small cottage, taking solace in her garden, but her mind remained far from idle. There was something about the case that still gnawed at her, a final detail that refused to fit perfectly into the neat pattern of events. That had played out. Edward's confession had seemed so straightforward, but in her heart Miss Marple knew that there was something more, something that even the most diligent investigation had overlooked. It was a few days after Constable Forrester's visit when the breakthrough came, though it was not in the way Miss Marple had expected. Miss Marple had been invited to tea at the home of Mrs. Westbrook, a local widow and friend who had lived in Fernwood for many years. The invitation had been extended with the usual politeness, and though Miss Marple had no great fondness for formal social gatherings, she had accepted, knowing that sometimes the most useful information could be found in the most innocuous of places. Mrs. Westbrook's house, a quaint stone cottage at the edge of the village, was cosy and warm. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the aroma of freshly brewed tea filled the air. They sat at the small table in the sitting-room, and Miss Marple listened intently as Mrs. Westbrook chattered on about the village gossip, her words flowing easily as she recounted the latest tidbits of information. It was during one of these casual exchanges that Mrs. Westbrook mentioned something that struck Miss Marple with the force of a revelation. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Westbrook said between sips of tea, "you must have heard about Clara, poor dear. I've heard she's been asking around, trying to get her hands on her mother's things, as though nothing ever happened." Miss Marple, whose attention had been somewhat distracted, now focused sharply on her friend's words. "Clara?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes narrowing with interest. "What do you mean, trying to get her hands on her mother's things?" Mrs. Westbrook lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Well, it's not just that. You see, Edward's confession came as quite a shock to everyone, but there are some whispers. Some people say that Clara and her father weren't exactly the best of friends, that there were things going on between them, things no one would ever want to speak of aloud." The conversation shifted then, as Mrs. Westbrook moved on to another topic, but Miss Marple's thoughts were already far from the tea-table. Clara's behaviour after the murder, her frantic attempt to take control of her mother's belongings, the coldness that had settled over her since the confession, all these details now seemed to take on new meaning. Miss Marple excused herself politely from Mrs. Westbrook's house and walked slowly back to her cottage, her mind racing. It wasn't until she had returned to the solitude of her home that the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. That evening, Miss Marple called Constable Forrester to her cottage. The constable arrived promptly, his brow furrowed with curiosity. Miss Marple gestured for him to sit, her expression calm but determined. "I've been thinking about Clara Gage," she began, her voice steady, "about her behaviour after her mother's death. It doesn't sit right with me." Forrester raised an eyebrow. "You think she's involved? I don't know," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But there is something strange about her. She has an interest in her mother's possessions that is beyond what one might expect. And there's something more, Constable. You see, when a person is guilty, they often reveal their true nature not through what they say, but through what they do." The constable shifted uneasily in his seat. Are you suggesting Clara might have had something to do with her mother's death? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said softly, that we've all been looking at the wrong person. Edward Gage may have confessed, but that doesn't mean he's the one responsible. Forrester's face showed his confusion, but Miss Marple continued. Think back to the days before the murder. Clara's coldness toward her mother, her apparent indifference to her mother's suffering, it all fits together. But it was Edward. Who was the scapegoat? He took the blame, as he had done so many times before. Wait, Forrester said, suddenly understanding. You think Clara killed her mother? Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Clara knew exactly what she was doing. She was the one who had the most to gain from her mother's death. Not Edward. Clara had been plotting for months, trying to manipulate things in her favour. She had been planning to take control of the family's wealth, and when her mother started to stand in the way, Clara couldn't afford to let her live. Forrester stood up abruptly, the realization dawning upon him. But how did she do it? Simple, Miss Marple replied. She used the same trick she had used with everyone else. She played the part of the grieving daughter, lulling everyone into a false sense of security. And when the time came, she struck. She knew Edward would be an easy target. He had always been the one to take the blame, the one to protect her, and when he confessed, no one questioned it. Forrester's face was pale as he absorbed the gravity of the situation. We need to confront her. I think it's time, Miss Marple said quietly. But be careful, Constable. Clara is a master of deception. She'll try to talk her way out of it, but we can't let her fool us any longer. The constable nodded and left Miss Marple's cottage, determined to bring the truth to light. Later that evening, Clara was taken into custody. She did not resist. In fact, she seemed almost relieved, as though she had been waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be exposed. As the constable and his men escorted her away, Miss Marple watched from her window, her heart heavy with the knowledge that the case was finally resolved. The village of Fernwood would return to its quiet existence, but the shadows of the past would never fully disappear. As Miss Marple reflected on the case, she could not help but feel a sense of melancholy. In the end, it was not just the murder that had shocked her, but the realization that even in the most peaceful of places, secrets fester and deceive, and the darkest of motives often hide behind the most innocent of faces. As the fire in her hearth flickered and the evening settled around her, Miss Marple closed her eyes and sighed. There was always another mystery, another truth to uncover, and in the quiet, unassuming corners of life, she would continue to look for the answers, one step at a time.